3 years. That is how long the bed on the left took to produce the way the label on the bag promised it would. The bed on the right was filled differently. It cost less than $40 to build. It produced a full harvest in its first season. The only difference between those two beds was what went inside and where it came from. Every spring, the same transaction happens at garden centers across North America. A gardener picks up a bag labeled Premium Raised Bed Mix, reads the words professional grade, and pays $14 or $18 or sometimes $22 for a product that was engineered to survive a warehouse, not to feed a plant. Here is what the label does not say. A bag of soil has one engineering requirement that has nothing to do with gardening. It has to survive the bag. It must remain chemically stable through 18 months of warehouse temperature swings, resist caking, and pour consistently, whether it is month 1 or month 18. Those are shelf requirements. None of them overlap with what a plant needs underground. That single constraint, shelf stability, is the root of every mistake on this list. What follows is 5 specific mistakes. They compound each other, which is why gardens filled the conventional way often underperform for years without the gardener ever identifying why. The final section covers the exact layered fill method, with costs broken down by layer, that consistently outperforms bagged mix starting in the first growing season. Before the mistakes, one principle. Because once you understand it, everything else makes sense. A raised bed is not a container. A container has no connection to what is beneath it. A raised bed sits on ground, and that distinction changes everything about how it should be filled. Think of a raised bed as 3 systems operating simultaneously. The first is above the fill, sun, rain, and temperature, all amplified because the wooden sides are exposed to air on every surface. The fill must buffer heat and moisture more aggressively than in-ground soil. The second system is below the fill. The native worm population, mycorrhizal fungal networks, drainage channels, and microbial communities that have existed in that ground for years. The third system is the fill itself, which either connects those 2 systems or severs them, depending entirely on what it contains and how it was installed. A raised bed, sealed from the native soil beneath it, behaves like a fish tank with a drain hole. Water moves through it. Nothing biological lives in it long term. A raised bed connected to the native ecosystem below self-regulates moisture, builds its own nutrition cycle, and improves automatically season after season. Same wooden frame, completely different outcome based solely on what sits inside and underneath. Every mistake on this list breaks that connection in one direction or the other. Mistake 1. Landscape fabric on the bottom. Landscape fabric on the base of a raised bed stops weeds from growing up through the bottom. That claim is accurate. What no label explains is what else it stops, and those losses are the reason that first bed took 3 years to produce. First, worm migration. The earthworm population in native soil moves vertically up into organic matter above and down into deeper soil when surface conditions become hostile. A woven polypropylene barrier stops that migration entirely. The fill above the fabric begins without its primary aeration and fertilization system, and that system never arrives. Second, mycorrhizal networks. Mycorrhizal fungi, the white thread-like structures visible in healthy disturbed soil, extend plant root reach by up to 100 times the physical root spread, mining phosphorus and micronutrients from distances the root itself cannot access. Those threads cannot cross woven polypropylene. The network stops at the barrier and does not reform above it. Third, drought buffering. Native soil acts as a moisture reservoir during dry periods. When fill is physically connected to native soil below, moisture equilibrates upward during heat. Fabric severs that connection. The fill dries faster and more completely during summer heat stress, precisely when the buffering matters most. The fix is cardboard. Overlap pieces by 6 inches across the entire base before adding any fill. Cardboard suppresses weed seed germination for 1 full growing season, then decomposes completely within 12 to 18 months, leaving no physical barrier between the fill and the native soil below. By the time it breaks down, the mycorrhizal networks and worm populations it temporarily slowed are already establishing upward. Cost, 0. Source, behind any grocery, appliance, or furniture store. Mistake 2. Bagged raised bed mix. A standard premium raised bed mix contains approximately 40 to 60% composted wood fiber, sawdust, and bark at various decomposition stages, 20 to 30% aged compost, and 10 to 20% perlite for drainage. The compost fraction is the critical component, and it has been heat pasteurized. Heat pasteurization kills pathogenic bacteria. Applied to compost, it also eliminates lactic acid bacteria, nitrogen-fixing organisms, and the fungal spore networks that make compost biologically valuable in the first place. What remains is the mineral skeleton of what soil does. The living system that operates the skeleton has been killed to satisfy a packaging requirement. A standard 4x8 raised bed at 12 inches deep requires approximately 16 cubic feet of fill. At $18 per 1.5 cubic foot bag, that is $192 to fill one bed. The layered native fill method detailed at the end fills the identical volume for between $20 and $40. And unlike the bagged version, it contains living microbial biology that compounds in activity every season it is left undisturbed. Mistake 3. Mel's Mix applied to standard backyards. In 1981, Mel Bartholomew designed a fill system for a specific problem. Gardeners growing in areas with no usable native soil, concrete lots, rooftop gardens, or contaminated urban ground. For that problem, the 1/3 compost, 1/3 peat moss, 1/3 vermiculite formula is excellent. The problem is applying a container formula to a ground-connected raised bed. First, peat moss. Peat is harvested from bogs that form over 1,000 years. It is also progressively acidic, with pH between 3.5 and 4.5, which means a bed filled with Mel's Mix requires consistent, active pH management to remain productive. Without that management, the bed becomes increasingly acidic across seasons and begins suppressing the very microbial activity the rest of the mix was designed to support. Canada and the United Kingdom have both moved to phase out peat moss for horticultural use on sustainability grounds. Second, vermiculite. At the volumes Mel's formula specifies approximately 4 cubic feet for a standard 4x8 bed, vermiculite costs between $80 and $120 for the vermiculite fraction alone. That is before compost or peat. Total fill cost for one bed using this formula is $150 to $200. Third, biological inertness by design. Mel's Mix contains no native microbial starter and establishes no connection to the native soil below the frame. It grows food, but every season begins from the same inert biological baseline. It does not build. A layered native fill increases in biological complexity every season without any additional input because it is connected to a living system below it. Mistake 4. No structural base layer. Raised bed fill settles. A bed filled to the rim in early spring typically sits 3 to 4 inches below the rim by midsummer. Most gardeners buy another bag and top it up. That approach costs money every season and resets the biological establishment process building beneath the surface. A raised bed with no structural base layer creates a second problem, less visible and more damaging. When fine fill material sits directly against dense native clay, which describes the majority of American suburban yards, a perched water table forms at the interface. A zone of standing moisture collects where the two textures meet because water moving downward through loose organic fill slows dramatically when it reaches compacted clay. Anaerobic bacteria thrive in that zone. Plant roots drown in it. The symptoms look exactly like drought stress: wilting, yellowing, poor fruit set. The cause is the opposite of drought. Fill the bottom quarter of any raised bed with coarse woody material before any soil goes in. Use logs, thick branches, wood chips, and cardboard arranged in deep overlapping layers. This base layer creates permanent drainage channels that prevent the perched water table. It acts as a slow-release nutrient sponge. As the wood decomposes over 3 to 5 years, it releases nitrogen, potassium, and trace minerals directly into the fill above it. It also buffers root zone temperature by retaining deep moisture that surface heat cannot reach. Cost: zero. Municipal tree services post free wood chip loads weekly on Craigslist and Facebook Marketplace in most American metro areas. Mistake 5. Treating the fill as a finished installation. 3 specific changes happen without active management. First, organic matter. Depletion. The compost fraction that creates air pockets and microbial habitat breaks down continuously. Without replacement, the bed compacts, air pockets close, root zones tighten, drainage slows. The bed that drained well in year 1 holds water in year 3, and the gardener cannot identify why. Second, pH drift. Most raised beds become progressively acidic across 3 to 4 seasons as organic matter decomposes. A gardener adding the same nitrogen fertilizer to increasingly acidic soil is feeding a chemistry problem with a nutrition solution. The symptoms look identical to underfertilization. The cause is entirely different. Third, phosphorus accumulation. Repeated fertilizer applications build phosphorus unevenly over time. High phosphorus specifically suppresses mycorrhizal fungi, the same networks the layered fill method is designed to cultivate. Research from the University of Kansas Soil Biology program found that soils with elevated phosphorus show measurably reduced mycorrhizal colonization rates. The biological system the bed was built around begins to shut down from the amendments meant to help it. Do not till in spring. Do not top up with bagged raised bed mix. Add 2 inches of finished living compost, locally sourced, not heat pasteurized, actively microbially rich, spread across the surface and left alone. Annual maintenance is removing the obstacles to that process, not adding more inputs. Here is the fill method, layer by layer, with the function and cost of each. Layer 1, the base. Coarse woody material such as logs, thick branches, deep wood chips, or heavy cardboard. For a standard 4x8 bed at 12 inches deep, this layer is 3 inches deep. It creates drainage channels, provides slow-release nutrition across 3 to 5 years, and buffers root zone temperature. Cost, $0. Layer 2, the transition. 60% native topsoil from the ground adjacent to, or beneath the bed frame. 40% rough, unfinished compost. This is the biological handshake. Native topsoil carries the specific microbial community already adapted to the local climate, rainfall pattern, and soil chemistry. Introducing that community here means the fill above will be colonized by organisms that already know the environment. Cost: $0 for native topsoil, $5 to $15 for rough compost from a municipal facility. Layer 3, the growing medium. 60% finished living compost, locally sourced and not heat pasteurized. 30% native topsoil to maintain the biological thread from the layer below. 10% perlite for drainage, the one purchased amendment in the stack, used sparingly. Cost $15 to $25. Standard premium bagged fill for one 4x8 raised bed costs approximately $192. This layered method for the identical bed costs $20 to $40. The difference in first season production consistently favors the layered native fill on fruit count per plant, mid-season plant height, disease incidence rate, and productive season length into autumn. A raised bed is not a purchase. Every bag on the garden center shelf is engineered to make it feel like one. It feels immediate, simple, and complete the moment it is in the cart. What this video covered takes slightly longer to set up and costs a fraction as much. Nothing in a bag improves on its own. A layered bed connected to the living system beneath it gets more productive every season without spending anything further. The shelf required stability. A garden requires biology. Those two things have never been the same. If you are filling or rebuilding a raised bed this season, leave one detail in the comments. What does your native soil look like below the frame? Clay, sand, rocky, or have you never checked? The base layer strategy changes depending on what sits beneath the bed, and the specific adjustment for each soil type is worth a follow-up. The shelf stability principle that runs through this video was introduced in the Garden Store Products video, linked here. If this raised bed argument made sense, that video explains why the same logic applies to almost every product in the garden center aisle.